today, the panelist who I will be interviewing, who has an incredible story, her name is Charlayne Hunter-Gault. I'm not going to talk too much about her because I want her to talk about herself, but I just want to thank her for being on this panel with me. I'm very excited for you guys to hear her story. It's incredible. But yeah, Auntie Charlayne, if you want to say a couple words, and then we could jump in.
Well, I just want to say hello to all these beautiful faces, people whom I recognize. I'm happy to see some South Africans on this call and some friends from long standing, including your mother. And I don't see is your father on yet?
My dad's there. He's over there.
Because you'll probably be embarrassed by this, but we've been together so long that I remember when your mother left our house where we shared with her when you were born. That's a wonderful time.
Yeah. That's so funny. Yeah, Auntie Charlayne is my godmother, for anyone who is wondering. But yeah, why don't we start, Auntie Charlayne? The first question I want to ask you is, why don't you give us a brief synopsis of your life? Tell us where you were born and where you grew up.
Oh boy. Well, brief. For 78 years, you want brief.
It doesn't have to be brief.
Okay. Well, actually, I was born in a little town that nobody has ever heard of, although a few now have, called Due West. And when I wrote my first book, I think I called the first chapter Due West of What? Because when somebody would say, where were you born? And I say Due West, they say Due West of what? But that was the name of the town in South Carolina. Some people know it today because there's a college, Erskine College there. And it's, it's a small town, but we didn't stay there long. My mother moved to Georgia, and my father was serving in the military. So when I was 9 months old, he hadn't yet seen me. So she traveled the long train journey to Riverside, California, and that's where I spent a part of my young life. But most of it was in Georgia, in a small town called Covington, which is a few miles from Atlanta. And then when I was in the 6th grade, we moved to Atlanta, and that was where I spent the rest of my life until I went away to college and then to professional school. So,
okay, cool. So you mentioned college. Why don't we talk a bit about that? Can you tell us when you went to university, which university you went to as well?
Well, initially in my senior year in high school, it was everything was segregated. Nobody on this panel will remember the days of legal segregation, but this was, I grew up in that time, and I went to a wonderful high school that was named for a Black pioneer by the name of Henry McNeil Turner. And so in my senior year, some very progressive African-American men who wanted to see change came to our school and asked if any of us would be interested in trying to get into one of the white schools downtown in Atlanta. And so the principal sent for me and my classmate. We were top students in the class, and asked if we were interested. And my classmate wanted to be a doctor, and I wanted to be a journalist. So we said, sure. So we went downtown, and what's interesting about the days of segregation is that the ruling class wanted us to feel second class, and everything they did was to reinforce the notion that we were second class. But my village that surrounded me from even due west, and then the small town of Covington, and then Atlanta, Georgia, it was a village of African-American people who, when they couldn't give us first-class citizenship legally, they gave us a first class sense of ourselves. And I mention that because we had a great education. And so when Hamilton Holmes and I went down to this Georgia State College in Atlanta, and we looked at the curriculum, and again, you know, white ruling class was saying that everything white was right. Well, these two high school seniors looked at the curriculum, and as I said, he wanted to be a journalist, he wanted to be a doctor, and I wanted to be a journalist. And we said, this isn't good enough. This is not going to prepare us in the way we want to be prepared. And these Black adults were shocked, even more so when Hamilton and I walked out of this building where we had looked at the curriculum and everything, and Hamilton pointed north to the University of Georgia, which was the state school, college, university for 170 years, all white. And when we said that, these Black adults were shocked. They thought, oh my God, how could we do that? What would we do? Because to get there, you had to drive through little towns that had members of the Ku Klux Klan. And in Atlanta, they felt they could protect us if there was reaction to our applying to Georgia State, but they didn't know anybody in Athens. And yet here we were prepared to try and go, and they couldn't say no. So I guess they thought, well, I guess we'll figure it out. And they agreed. And from that point on, from 1959 all the way up to 1961, the application that we made to Georgia eventually had to be fought in the court. And in 1961, I had entered a college in Detroit, Michigan, and Hamilton was going to the top Black men's college in Atlanta, Morehouse College. I was at Wayne State University. But in January 61, after a court hearing on our case, it took about a year and a half, we were finally admitted under court order to the University of Georgia. And it was the first time that any Black students had ever been allowed to go to that institution.
And I'm curious, how were you when you got there, and your friend who was the medical student, being you were the only Black woman on campus, how were you treated by white students and faculty members during your time in university there?
Well, initially it was ugly. The students met, they gathered at the entrance to the school, to the university, and shouted really ugly words to us, and some of you probably could think of some of them. Nowadays we say the N-word, but it wasn't the N-word then, it was the whole word. But, you know, as I told you a few minutes ago, we had this village that brought us up. And when our school couldn't give us, didn't have the resources from the white establishment to get books for us, because the books we got were hand-me-down from the white schools, and a lot of them had pages torn. They used to have a fundraiser to make up for what they weren't getting from the establishment. And our parents and our friends and people would just raise money, and whichever family got the most money, their child would be crowned king or queen. And one time, I think I was in the 5th grade, my family raised the most money, my grandmother and my mother. And I got a crown and a bull of a watch. Well, the diamond tiara that crowned me queen, I wore, well, several days, because I eventually became insufferable to my classmates because I was walking around as the queen. So I took off the crown, the diamond tiara, but somehow the notion that I was the queen took up residence in my head. And so all those years later, I'm now 19. That was when I was in the 5th grade, so you can figure out how old that was. When I walked onto the campus of the University of Georgia and they were shouting that N-word, go home, I was looking around, where is this so-and-so they're calling an N-word? Because I knew who I was. I was the queen. And I was still insufferable, but I think it was the armor. I call that armor that that village of mine, that segregated all Black village from Due West to Covington to Atlanta, I think it was the armor that they created, that when they couldn't give us first class citizenship, they gave us a first class sense of ourselves. So when the students called us ugly names, and one night I was in a dormitory all by myself, in a room all by myself, on a floor all by myself, and they rioted and they threw bricks through my window, and somehow, you know, I've been asked about it a lot, and every time I come up with the same answer: I wasn't afraid. And they said, why weren't you afraid? And again, it was lessons from that village. I mean, one of the villages was my grandparents in Florida. My grandfather was one of these old time religion preachers, but my grandmother was a saint, and she taught me Bible verses, which I didn't want to learn at 5 and 6 and 7 years old. But here again, the notion of a queen came back, and also some of those Bible verses, because one night the riot was so bad outside of my dorm, they were throwing bricks through the window, and the dean came and said that I was going to be taken out for my own safety. And I thought that was a ruse, but what could I say? He was in charge. And so the next day I walked out. They had dispersed finally the mob with tear gas late. They came late deliberately. But the next day they had whisked us back to Atlanta, the 70 some miles away. And the journalists were all there saying, you know, what was it like going through that tear gas in that dark night? Da, da, da. I said, it was fine. And they said, it was fine. Why was it fine? And the funny thing was, it was fine in my subconscious, but when they asked me and I had to think about it, my mind went all the way back to those lessons that that village, including my sainted grandmother, had taught me. Because one of the things she used to insist I was a tomboy. So I used to climb trees, the mango tree in Florida where they were, and she would hunt me down because I would hide from her. I didn't want to learn these Bible verses. But here, years later, as I walked into that dark night, I thought subconsciously, but it protected me. It was the armor that I was wearing. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Now, not all of you might be religious, and I've been through several iterations of religion. I'm still a person of faith, although I don't have a specific denomination. But that was what got me through that night and through so many other challenging times, that those early lessons that I had been taught by my parents and my grandparents and my community. It was a village that raised this child to be who I am today and got me through some pretty challenging times.
Wow. So you've just known your whole life that you're a queen, which is epic.
Well, yes.
Okay.
I'm around here somewhere, but I don't know where it is. It's invisible.
And I can see it. And so after, studying in university, you went on to become a journalist. And in the journalism industry, did you face difficulties as a Black woman trying to make a name for yourself?
Not really, because I was hired first by the New Yorker magazine. There was a wonderful, legendary editor by the name of William Shawn. And he reached out to me. He had read about me in the newspaper, and he reached out and hired me first as an editorial assistant, and said I could go wherever my talents or interests would take me. And I was surrounded by, as an editorial assistant, in those days, none of you will know about this, but there were typewriters. And I used to type rejection slips to people who had submitted their, fiction or their fact or whatever they were trying to get into the New Yorker. And the boy who sat, a young man who sat across from me was writing, and he was trying to get promoted. And another one in the room was writing poetry, and she was trying to get promoted. And in those days, one of the big things at the New Yorker were reminiscence pieces. And so I read people's reminiscence pieces, and then I thought one day, I have a reminiscence. So I wrote this piece about how my grandmother used to bring me from this little town in Georgia, Covington, before we moved to Atlanta, to New York to see my uncle in Harlem. And I thought, that should be interesting to the readers of the New Yorker. At least I thought, maybe. So I wrote this piece, and I called it, the address where the apartment building was in New York was 115th between Lenox and 5th. And that's what I called the piece. And it was just a reminiscence of coming from this small Georgia town all the way to New York, all the way to Harlem. And it was the first time I had ever met anybody who wasn't white. I met Puerto Ricans who lived in the building next. And so that expanded my mind at a very young age about people of color, that they weren't just Black, but they were of different colors, and they spoke different languages. And also this was urban. So whereas we used to play hopscotch in the dirt in Georgia, these kids played hopscotch on the cement streets, 115th, between Lenox and 5th. And so I wrote this piece, and I got up the nerve to slip it under Mr. Sean's door. And Calvin Trillin, who became a legendary writer for the New Yorker, was also at that time, he had covered me going into the University of Georgia. And by this time, he had written a book about that experience, and he was hired at the New Yorker. So I got a little nervous when I hadn't heard from Mr. Sean. So I took it to Bud, and I said, would you kind of look at this? I just submitted it. And he came and he put it on my desk after he'd read it. It wasn't that long. And he said, He said, all of this is just about having fun in Harlem. You need to be writing about how come people are having such a rough time up there. And I thought, oh God, I have really embarrassed myself now. Oh my goodness. I was so embarrassed that I had turned in this piece to Mr. Sean and hadn't written the right thing. And a few minutes after Bud left my office, Mr. Sean called, and he called me Miss Hunter. He was very formal. And I said, yes, Mr. Sean. I thought, oh God, I'm going to have to apologize for taking up his time with this piece that I shouldn't have written. And he said, well, I've read your piece, 115th between Lenox and 5th. That's the way he talked. He said, and if it's all right with you, and I'm still getting a few little teary-eyed. He said, if it's all right with you, we'd like to publish it in our magazine. And I just nearly fell over. I didn't know what to say. I said, sure. Mr. Sean, thank you very much. That's fine. And I just hung up the phone, and I sat there and I just couldn't believe it. And so later, when I got myself together and I was talking to my friend about it, he said, well, how much are they going to pay? I said, pay? I don't want any money. I'm just happy to have my piece in the paper, in the magazine with my name on it. He said, do you not realize what this deal is? You're becoming a professional. You're supposed to get paid. And so I was learning lessons about becoming a professional, but I was also learning lessons about something else that I hope has characterized my journalistic journey. And that is that while there are a lot of problems in our communities, especially our African-American communities and our communities of color. And it's the same approach I took when I lived in South Africa. It's not all bad. And, like I wrote something once where I was criticizing how Africa was covered, the 4 Ds, death, disease, disaster, and despair or destruction. And there is that, but there's also a positive side. And I think that's one of the problems that our media don't focus on today. Now they're focusing right now on all the demonstrations and everything, but I think that the stereotypes of our people have dominated our media for so long that that's part of the reason we have so many problems today, that there's no understanding of our people, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of the dimensions of us, because in the end, we're just human beings like everybody else.
Yeah, I'm curious because you mentioned South Africa, and I was curious because you lived in South Africa post-apartheid era in the early 90s. So I'm curious, what are your similarities what do you think the similarities are between South Africa and the United States when it comes to racial oppression and injustice?
Well, it goes back to when I first went there, it was 1985. Those were the dark days of apartheid, when we journalists were pretty much what we're being called by some people today, but I won't go into that. But we were not seen as friendly when we journalists got there. So I covered the days of apartheid in 85, and those were pretty ugly. And then I went back just after Nelson Mandela had been released. And of course, nothing had changed. And then during his administration and the subsequent one by Thabo Mbeki, things did change. And yet they haven't changed enough. But there's a consciousness on the part of so many people, like your father, your family, and others in South Africa, even during this pandemic, who are doing real work to help the people. I don't know if any of the Randeros are on this call, but I've been so impressed with the Randera family, because all of them have made contributions, including one of the sons who started a project to help young entrepreneurs in Soweto become more engaged in how they deal with their product. There's another way I should have put that, but to become more professional, in other words, and therefore more successful. And I just think that there is a generation of young people, including yourself, who are conscious and who are trying to help South Africa, which continues like other parts of Africa and the United States, to try and reach what the Constitution, the South African Constitution, which of course is one of the most progressive in the world, but to try to live up to that Constitution, just as what is happening here in America today. So it was a wonderful time. I'll never forget all of the friends that we made there when we when we were living there for 17 years. We continue to be in touch with them in conversations online and emails, and until the pandemic, some would come and visit us in our summer place in Massachusetts. So it's been, and also the rest of Africa. It's not just South Africa, because I was reading something that I wrote a while ago about the ways in which various South African countries were moving towards greater democracy, including some where women like Ellen Johnson Sirleaf had become, president, and came in with a very strong emphasis on equality for women. And one of the areas I concentrated on in when I was living in South Africa, but traveling all over the continent, was the role of women. And like everywhere, we've all had to struggle to become equal, all the way back to our own struggles here in the United States. But there've always been women who've been leading the charge and who've not been dissuaded or depressed or distressed by the opposition to them becoming totally equal to men. I don't know if that answered the question.
Well, you actually bring out a very good point, because, just for me personally, I've been having a lot of discussions with my Black male friends in America. And, even it feels like with the Black Lives Matter movement, that's really being carried on the weight of women's shoulders, that, like Black men don't do enough for those movements. And it's interesting that you mentioned the role of women, because it'll be interesting to see, how, as this plays out, at least in my perspective, if more men will come forward and I guess take some of the weight off. Because I know also from some conversations I've had with my Black female friends, they definitely do also, carry that sentiment that, Black men specifically don't care about them. But that's something that we can talk about as well. But I wanted to ask you, so it's been 57 years now since you graduated, being the first Black woman at the University of Georgia. And what, in your opinion, are some of the most significant changes that have taken place since then, in your perspective?
And you mean what kind of?
Well, changes when it comes to race. So I guess from when you were living then until currently now, what do you think has changed significantly?
Well, it's a complicated history. One of the things that I think people are starting to look at now is how the current protests relate to historical protests. And I think that I have to say that when I was at the University of Georgia, although Hamilton and I were alone there, at the same time, the civil rights movement was aborting all over the South and in Atlanta. So while at the University of Georgia, there was a newspaper, student newspaper, the Red and Black, and I thought, okay, I'll get my work, I'll get some experience writing for the newspaper here at the school. But the town was still segregated. And so there was nowhere that they could send me and I'd be accepted as a journalist. So on the weekends, I would go to Atlanta, 73 miles away. And I worked with a group of students who were trying to change things, the segregated society in Atlanta, the Atlanta student movement. And in a way, they were the precursors of these movements that we see today. Now, the majority of them, if not all of them, were African American, or now we say Black. But they were doing things that were of great danger and sacrifice to themselves. But they would go and picket in front of segregated everything, department stores and churches and things like that. And initially, their motto was jail without bail. Because they would be arrested if they stayed too long, and many of them did get arrested, and they went to jail. And they didn't separate them from. They separated the men from the women, including Martin Luther King, by the way. But the women, the young students, college students, were put in jail cells along with murderers and women who had done serious crimes. And yet those women, in spite of why they were in prison, embraced those young people and helped them to deal with the time that they were spending in these jails. But they went to jail without bail was their motto, so that they could challenge these laws of segregation in the courts. Now, eventually that all got worked out. But I say all that to say that it bothers me just a little bit when we don't talk about the history of young people who have challenged bad things, bad laws in this country in particular, but South Africa too, and realize that they laid the foundation, really, for the kinds of demonstrations that are happening today. Now, there are differences, of course, because in those days you had 3 television stations, and a few radio stations, but you didn't have the kind of, initially, you didn't have the kind of coverage that we're getting today. And therefore, and also there was the notion, well, the reality that everybody focused on segregation in the South, so that those demonstrations were aimed at changing the laws of segregation in the South. What they had not focused on and didn't at that time was what we came to call Up South, which was the North, which was as segregated in so many ways as the South. And so initially there was a limited geography, shall we say, to those protests, although they were all over the South. And there was limited coverage because you had only 3 television stations. But today, there is a reality of massive media coverage of all kinds, good, bad, and, well, let's just leave it there. But it's good coverage that shows the world how America is reacting, American students and others are reacting to these unjust situations. And so you have greater coverage and you have a more diverse group. Although what we also tend to forget is that there were white people who marched with us or with the students, and some who died for us. I'll never forget Viola Liuzzo. I'll never forget Goodman and Schwerner, who gave their lives in the South, helping us to get equality. So on the weekends, I would go to Atlanta and work for this small newspaper that was covering the student movement. And that's where I got a lot of very good experience, because the students would get arrested in the morning, and before they went to jail without bail, they get arrested in the morning, they get bailed out in the afternoon, and then they'd come to this professor's basement where we worked for this newspaper and tell us their stories of what had happened to them that day. And I would write those stories. So that's where I got my early journalistic training, writing about the students and their protests and their goals and ultimately their successes. And so they laid the groundwork, I think, for what is going on today. And to go back to your earlier question, many of the leaders in that group, in those protests, were women.
Mm. And, we just touched on movements. So I'm curious, do you see a difference between the Black Lives Matter movement and other civil rights movements in the past?
Well, I mean, we've had movements going back to, 1619 in this country. And as I said just a few minutes ago, I think that you have a broader representation, but I'm reading a book by a professor in Texas by the name of Peniel Joseph. And the book is called The Sword and the Shield. And it's comparing and contrasting Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And early on, each of them had very different approaches to dealing with segregation or to dealing with inequity and all of the things that these movements were then and are now addressing. And that's why I'm so delighted that you're talking to me, because I'm not one of the world's experts, although I can share a few things. But I think our history is so important, because one of the things I'm reading and remembering, because I forget things too at this age, but one of the things I'm remembering, being enabled to remember through Peniel Joseph's book, is the protests that went on, and the challenges that they had, and the different perspectives, and the fact that as the Nation of Islam progressed in its challenges to the system of segregation, and then you had not only the Nation of Islam, but you had the Black Panthers, and and you had slogans. I'm trying to remember one of them that I heard the other night in something I was listening to. But there are not a lot of differences. We just don't we don't teach the history in our schools. And so it looks as if this is something that has just come out of whole cloth, but there's a history to this. And while this movement is much more, shall we say, broad in its representation of people of all races and colors, and larger, and also geographically more diverse, there's an origin, there's a history here that I think it's important to study, because when we study the history of civil rights movements in this country, say going way back into the 1800s even, there are things we can learn from them. And I think I was reading another column where somebody said that this was the largest demonstration ever in the history of this country. Well, that's just not true. And I don't think that's to take away anything from what's happening. But, I mean, these young people, for example, who protested the murders in these schools, when these crazy people went in and murdered children, these were led by young people who have a consciousness. But that consciousness didn't just happen out of nowhere. There's a history that helps that kind of consciousness form. And I think that's all the more reason why we need to ensure that our young people and our middle-aged and our elderly, like me, that we insist that our schools begin to teach this history, so that we can build upon not only the successes of the past, but the times when things in the past didn't get what we needed. And so I think that I love the objectives of the leadership of these protest movements, and I know they're going to be successful. But one of the things that I'm learning, once again, having emphasized in Pennell's book, is that what Martin Luther King used to say, it wasn't originated with him, but it's the case that the arc of the moral universe is long and it's difficult, but it bends towards justice. And I remember interviewing Archbishop Desmond Tutu once at the Ford Foundation. He was on the panel. He was one of the people, and the other one was Madeleine Albright, who'd been Secretary of State and who's still out there, nowadays. She's really great. And so Archbishop Tutu was criticizing, I think it was President Clinton, for some international thing he had done that he didn't think was cool. And he was very critical of the United States. I mean, the United States stands for such and such, but it needs to live up to its creed and da-da-da-da-da. So then I said, okay. And I turned to Madeleine Albright and I said, so what's your response to that? Because he had been pretty sharp in his criticism. And she said very simply, I think she said, listen, honey, democracy is messy. And I just love that, because you put those two things together. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And you put in the middle of that, democracy is messy. And that's where we need to be right now in our understanding of what these movements are up against. In South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria. And by the way, I was on a program just like this, a Zoom, it was Skype, with a Nigerian television station the other day. James Blue is smiling because he had something to do with that. James Blue is my producer, and I'm so glad to see him on this. He's my producer at the News Hour. But their activism is mirroring, much of the activism there is mirroring the activism here, as it is all over the world. And again, I think one of the differences is not so much the objective and the day-to-day going about it, but it's this communications linkages that have expanded so that it doesn't take several days or weeks or whatever for people in South Africa to find out what's going on in Arkansas or Florida or New York. I mean, it's instantaneous. And so I think that where we are in this moral arc is at a very critical moment. It doesn't mean that however successful this activism is, and it will be in many ways, we don't know how many, but it will be, I'm sure of that. Police reform, incarceration of people of color in excess of others, the pandemic, which is just wreaking havoc, especially in communities of people of color, but all people, younger and younger people. There are going to be these challenges, but I think that there are mechanisms today, including communication, that are going to maybe make some of the resolutions a lot faster and with a lot more people involved. Mm-hmm. Of all ages, by the way, because I just have this one other thing I'll say is that I'm not, what's the song I was singing the other day? I come too far. I don't feel no ways tired, even at my age. I've come too far from where I've started from. Nobody told me the road would be easy. I don't believe you brought me this far to leave me. So what I'm calling for is a coalition of the generations, so that your generation and your little brother's generation, he's on this call, I think, and even younger ones will listen to what we have to say, even though we go on ad infinitum and don't stop talking, once we get started. But I think we have things that we can share. And I think that it's that generation that is now out there in the streets, which is a generation, I've seen multi-generational representatives out there, but it's being it's generally led by younger and younger people. But I think we have some things that we can share, because I think that this armor that I talked about, which is our history, is armor that can get polished by every generation. They take our history, they make history. The history they make, or this generation makes, the next generation, your little brother's generation, they will polish armor from the history of the previous generation. So I think there are things that we can learn, and there are mistakes. We've all made mistakes. There's something that I don't think people remember, especially younger people, but a lot of the older people don't either. But there's a lot of discussion now about police reform, okay, which is totally spot on. One of the things, however, when the politicians out there are asked about this, they don't seem to remember that Black communities were being overrun by drug dealers when President Clinton was president, and there was a crime bill that came up, and the Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, which represented people who were Black, supported this because that's what they wanted, more protection in their communities from drug dealers who were killing a lot of their young people. Now, eventually that changed over time, but you need to know that history when you start holding people accountable for positions that they took then and positions that they're taking now. There's all kinds of history that I think this younger generation, which has more opportunities and more ways of learning history, need to use those so that they can become even more successful than the previous generations.
For sure. I'm going to ask you one more of my personal questions, and then, we can take some questions from other people. And
you mean about the night you were born? Because I was there.
I know. I've heard about it many times. But so my last question for you, Auntie Charlayne, is, in your opinion, right, where do you see America and racism heading if Donald Trump gets reelected?
Now, you don't want me to go there.
I do.
Let me answer your question. I have a little bit of a problem being a Black woman, being a woman, being a journalist, and being 78. And sometimes those things come into a little bit of conflict, like now, because I don't do op-eds. I do a series looking at solutions to racism, and my producer is still on the phone call. I hope so. I hope one of mine will be on next week, because there are solutions to racism, and I think we're starting to focus on them a little bit because we've got more unity than is currently realized, I think, in this country. And that's what our conversation is going to be about. And so this is a difficult question for me because I am in my one incarnation as a journalist. So what I will very carefully say as I try to answer your question is this. Our young people who are able to vote and who are able to get out and help people who may not be up to speed on how they can vote by mail or however they are doing it in this moment of the pandemic, need the history that I've been talking about, and they need the information about what's going on in this country and who it is affecting and in what ways it is affecting them. And they need to listen to all of the people who have access to microphones. And with the history that I hope they are absorbing about the promise of this country, based in a constitution that had to be changed over time so that all of the people in this country could be represented. Education is going to help them, instead of me, answer your question. What I will say also is that there are times when I had a grandmother who loved wrestling, and she would get so excited about wrestling and the person that she was in favor of on one side of the match, that one night I saw her come up to the television with a vase in her hand like this. And she was about to hit the television because her guy was losing and the other guy was cheating. And I said, Grandma, don't hit the television. Don't hit the... And she said, oh, okay. Well, there are nights when I become my grandmother. these days, maybe it's because I'm the age that she was then, I don't know. But there are nights when I'm shouting at the television, when I'm listening to some of our leaders, and I'm saying, my God, what are they teaching our children? I mean, some of the terms that they're using, some of the lies that they're telling, some of the misinterpretations of our history that they're putting out there. Now, I'm not going to name any names, but I'm looking at who's on this discussion. And I don't have to name any names. I'm still in my corner, not as my grandmother, but as a journalist. But when you educate yourself to the dynamics of our democracy and the dynamics of all democracies in this world, I think that you will be inspired to get out there and help people on this moral arc do the right thing by all of the people, not only in this country, but in the world. And if you value, you young people, if you value the next generation coming behind you, it's, even though your armor is being polished, you've got to polish their armor. And you've got to be able to teach them about the values of our Constitution. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And our history teaches us what justice is. We don't have to listen to somebody on a golf course today telling us what is right or what is not right. We will know. And so if there's anything I want to encourage our young people, and some of our older ones as well, is to study that history, to study our Constitution, to study the South African Constitution, which is one of the most progressive in the world. I mean, the South African Constitution was the first to make legal people who to make legal LGBTQ rights. And so we've got these wonderful constitutions, and all we have to do is read them and see where we are diverging and who is diverging from a country that guarantees equal rights for every citizen, regardless of race, creed, color, national origin, sexual preference. Did I get everybody? If I didn't, tell me who I left out. But everybody who has breath, let's put it that way. Everybody who has breath, even if they're on a ventilator right now because of COVID-19, they'll be out because we've trained doctors of every race, creed, color, gender, sexual preference. They're going to heal these people. So we've got to help educate, and we've got to teach. Even if we're not teachers in schools, we've got to teach. And so I'm just saying, I'm here, and I want you to remember the coalition of the generations, because older people have something to teach, and the younger people need everything they can in their arsenal as they walk along the moral arc. We have a constitution that is an amazing document. It has been amended over the years because, to start with, it wasn't perfect. And in the 60s, it changed to become more perfect. 2 or 3 times it was amended. And right now, if you go back and look at it, it's a wonderful document with the changes that were made. And yet it took a long time to get those changes. But it is a constitution that guarantees rights to every breathing human being, regardless of race, creed, color, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there have been challenges in recent years to some of the things that have been created as a result of those principles within that Constitution. But change, even when you move forward, is still a hard row to hoe. And so while on the one hand, as I said about my marriage, you have to have patience, on the other hand, you have to have people who understand the process and how to change it. Very little is going to happen overnight. So on the one hand, you need the pressure that says things need to change, and they need to change tomorrow. They're not going to change tomorrow. That's not how this system works. But they will change if people stay on the case. If they, in the words of that old civil, I'm going to go back to my time, keep on keeping on. So it bothers me a little bit when I hear, well, I don't like this one because he's boring and he's old, and I don't like this one because of this, that, and the other. What is your alternative at the moment? And the argument that I think is easy to make is, okay, like my husband could have said to this person who said ain't nothing happened for me in the last 8 years. I told him the other day, if you're going to keep registering voters this time around, maybe you want to say, if ain't nothing happened for you in the last 8 years, let me tell you, if this change doesn't happen, what's going to happen for you in the next 8 years. Let me be very clear on what's going to happen to you, an African-American, Black, whatever you want to call them. What's going to happen to you if nothing changes? Okay? Now, the person that you're working with to put in office may not be perfect, but look at what that person is going to do for you negatively, and look at what the other person is going to do for you negatively. And then let's look at what's going to happen to one of those persons, what he's going to do for you positively, and what the other person is going to do for you positively. So, I mean, it's hard work, but that's why I'm so enamored of this generation and their promise, because they're smart. They got equipment like we've never had in life up to now. And they can go. There was a young kid who he was 18 or 19 years old. I forget now how, somebody here remember. In December, he went on his computer and figured out where this pandemic was going. In December, we have systems, and you have to work within those systems and figure out how to make those systems work for you. Now, that's something I can't do for you. You have to do that for yourself. But the minute I hear a young person, I haven't heard it yet because I've been self-quarantining, but if I hear somebody say, I don't think that I can vote because I don't see any options out here that appeal to me, I'm going to say to that person, you know what's going to happen if you don't vote? Or you know what could happen if you don't vote? Look at what's going to happen if this person is in charge. Look at what's going to happen if that person is in charge. And I think that those two things will help you decide whether you're going to sit on your butt or get out there and work. I think that's a non-starter, that I'm not going to vote because I don't see any options. Excuse me? You don't see any options? Let me tell you where you're going to end up if you don't see any options and you stay at home and don't vote. You got to get out there with your mask on and talk to people. You got to tell them what the options are. If you look, well, no, I don't want to go political, but educate yourself as to what's going on in this country and around the world. I will speak as a journalist on this one thing, which I do go publicly. I talk about how, no, we are humans. Journalists are human beings, and we make mistakes. But most of us are servants of the people, and we try to get the truth out there as best we can with our human capacities, which sometimes make mistakes and sometimes not. But most of us are servants of the people. And if you look at who is talking about fake news and enemies of the people, look around the world at who's saying that. Who is it? It's autocrats. It's dictators. You do not find a single person who is committed to the principles of true democracy talking about fake news and enemies of the people. Just think about it. So sometimes turn off your computers, turn off your television set. Don't binge watch like I do half the night and then have to sleep late in the morning. Spend time looking at what's going on in this country in particular right now, or you can do it in any country. Look at judgeship positions that are open, and look at who may be filling those and where they are in relation to the things that you care about. And say, now, if so-and-so is elected, these kind of people are going to be put in that position. If so-and-so is elected, these kind of people are going to be. There are all kinds of things that can happen from the top that will depend on who is running the country and who is setting the stage for what's going to happen to you. It's hard work. And so when people say to me, when I hear somebody say, well, I just really don't think I'm going to vote. Okay. It means you're lazy as shit. That's all I have to say.